Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Giulia D'Agnolo Vallan, and this is SI Harbor Cinema Conversation.
Joining us from Hong Kong is filmmaker Elizabeth Law, and she's a director of the movie Stray, which is shown in our virtual cinema, and I strongly suggest everybody that hasn't watched it yet watches it because it's a very unique and a special movie and from a very special point of view. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I love the idea of a live Q&A. I haven't experienced too many of those.
I'm going to start from the very beginning. You wanted to make a movie about strays, and initially it was not focused just on one city. But what did you like from a cinematic point of view about focusing on strays, in particular stray dogs?
I think stray dogs, by their nature, can be great vehicles. I knew that because stray dogs occupy public spaces and are not allowed into private spaces, the types of populations that stray dogs would encounter would also be those who are either relegated to public spaces or occupy public spaces, like the women and the Women's March fighting for their rights on the streets, or musicians busking on the side of the road, or the refugees who share the streets with the dogs. And then on the other hand, I think as somebody who's fascinated by sentience outside of our own humanity, stray dogs offer us this window into looking at a species that we're so familiar with, but who most of us define our relationship to them through our ownership of them or our friends' ownership of them. And this was an opportunity to really document what a dog does when left to their own devices, the decisions they make on a daily basis, whether to cross a road, where to find food, who they choose for companionship. I was fascinated to see where a dog would lead us and to let go of my own sort of human desires for story, a conventional story, and allow the dog to take over.
There was a peculiarity of Turkey and Istanbul itself that led you to focus on that particular city as opposed to other places in the world. Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, it was in the course of my research about stray dogs and which cities had unique relationships with them that I came across Turkey's and Istanbul's, which I think is unrivaled in the world, where the dogs were persecuted for 100 years, when the British actually in the 1910s forced the Turkish government to round up all their unattended animals and banish them to an island where they would starve to death. This was in retaliation for one British diplomat falling to his death when visiting Istanbul and was chased by a pack of dogs. And so shortly afterwards, huge fires broke out in the city because there were no dogs to warn the citizens about them. And World War I happened. So Istanbulites saw the exiling of the dogs as a curse on Turkey and Istanbul. And so over the next 100 years, even as the Turkish government tried to eradicate stray dogs in this attempt to emulate London and Paris and New York, where there are no animals on the streets except our pets, the people fought and protested for the rights of dogs to remain free and to roam freely. And in 2004, they passed these laws where you can't kill them and you can't hold them in captivity. And so now, today, there's this remarkable phenomenon of we're in this really modern, developed city, and yet dogs are roaming throughout it. And to me, as a foreigner who has grown up in cultures in Hong Kong and in the US that are not used to seeing stray dogs wandering around, I was really drawn by and struck by this interspecies connection that was so unfamiliar and so joyful to me.
You don't only film them, you are, as you said below, you have adopted their point of view. At which point in the process did you just make that choice, and how did you come to conceptualize it?
Well, very early on, I knew that the film had to be from a literal dog's point of view. I feel like so many films that pretend to be about dogs don't even bother to see the world literally from their height, which this film mostly takes place at 2 feet. And that was so important because I don't know what the real impact is on audiences, but I think just from seeing the world at a slightly defamiliarized angle, it does something to your perspective. It's asking you and inviting you to step outside of your human-centric worldview and adopt a foreign one. And I think that act can be profound. And I figured out a rig, I guess, where I was holding, the rig was basically my body. I was just crouching low the whole time,
By
holding.
rig is the camera, you know,
Yeah,
is the camera setup. Okay,
yeah. I had a
yeah.
stabilizer with the camera, and I would just hold it really low the whole time.
And you film most of the film yourself?
Yeah, I filmed it entirely myself. I think because it's an observational documentary, I'm not sure what else I would be doing if I was just directing it. And I'm not able to ask the dogs to perform.
Was it hard? Was it hard for you to abandon, to let go of the anthropocentric mindset?
Yeah, at first, people kept asking me, whose story is this? You know, is this a story about humanity? Because part of the concept of the film was to watch dogs watching us and see what that revealed. Or is this a story about dogs? And I realized by the end of production, as Zaytun's life, the main stray dog character, weaves in and out of the different humans' lives, and in the end, she's solitary. The conclusion I came to was that whether she's human or non-human, this is like a false dichotomy, that the stories of dogs are inherently intertwined with ours. And to pose this dichotomy between whether it's our view or their view was something that I had come in as sort of my cultural upbringing, the divide between those two. And this film is trying to blur those boundaries, that, you know, humanity is in the dogs. And of course, it's in all the people around those dogs too.
I have a question in the chat that is relevant, so I'll give from Mary. It's how did you find these characters? How did you find your protagonists?
One day, my co-producer Zainab and I were just wandering through an underground tunnel that was very busy, full of people, and suddenly we saw these two gigantic dogs weaving in between people's feet, really running with a sense of purpose. And we were intrigued by them. And so we chased after them, and they turned out to be Zaytun and Nazar, who are named by the young men who are from Syria, who they were on the heels of. And it was really Zaytun's independence and stubbornness and refusal to let us orchestrate her movement through the city. Other dogs that we tried to film with would inadvertently follow us back and bond with us, which undermined the conceit of the film, which was to let a dog take you through a city. Zaytun was one of the only dogs who was able to somehow allow me to film inches from her face, but still not react to me, and would just go off on her own and allow me to follow her. So she sort of fulfilled that promise of what happens when you leave a narrative up to a dog. And that's how she emerged as a star.
She's a real star. How did you keep track of your star? You know, I mean, they lead the narrative, but how did you establish a relationship with her, which must have been a relationship of trust because you were filming very, very close, and yet independence? I mean, how did you know where she would be to film her, and if she would be agreeable? You know, how did you direct her?
Yeah, I don't think that I could direct her much, but at the end of each day of shooting, we would put on these small collars that had GPS trackers attached to them that would sync up to our phones. So overnight, we'd be able to see where she went throughout the city. And then the next morning, we'd be able to find her again. And sometimes those GPS trackers would be stolen by people. But then we would go to the usual cafes that she liked to go to and would find her usually sleeping in one of the cafes until late in the afternoon. So that's how we found her every day. And then I think the dogs of Istanbul are treated so well in general that they're all very well socialized and all quite trusting of people. So it was very easy to gain her trust as a human being. And somehow she just tolerated me following her around everywhere.
Can you talk a little about the use of sound? Because she crosses different words in different parts of the city, and you capture those realities. A lot of it is simply through sound. You don't really stop too much on the human reality of it, but we hear it. Can you talk a little bit about the sound design of the film?
Yeah, so the sound design was done by Ernst Carroll, who had done the extraordinary sound work on Leviathan, the documentary that takes place on a fishing vessel with GoPros, and then also Sweetgrass, which was a 10-year-long project following the last sheep being herded through Montana. And I really wanted to work with him because he is so good at having the rigor to place ambient city sounds, the sounds of birds fluttering, at the same level and the same frequency as human dialogue that can be so seductive to us because we're human. So of course we're interested in the gossip and the juicy love stories or politics of humans unfolding around the dogs. But I was always very cognizant of wanting the film to remain with the dog's perspective. So dogs might be interested in our dramas, but they can just as quickly lose interest and leave a riveting conversation. So that was kind of how the editing of those conversations happened. And the sound work mimics the echoing feeling, or the loss of interest is sort of mimed through the sounds fading into the ambience. And we tried to also heighten the frequencies in certain parts to try to grasp at a cinematic representation of dog hearing, which is obviously different than ours, where frequencies are much higher than how we hear, where you hear the sounds of twigs snapping that are not natural to our hearing range. But it's meant to be heard in a 5.1 surround sound, so it's been sad that it's mostly playing over people's laptops or TVs.
But I have a question from John. Did you ever feel like interacted with the dog's life, like you wanted to save them, protect them, change the course of their day? How did you handle that?
Yeah, in Istanbul, sometimes we would try to feed the dogs, but for the most part, they had such a rich diet throughout the city. They didn't want anything we had to offer them. And with Zeytin and Nazar, I had no question in my mind ever that their lives were better on the streets of Istanbul than what I could ever provide them if they had to make the transition into being pets that were leashed and constrained in their daily schedules. But with Kartal, the puppy in the film, who obviously starts to suffer under the care of the young men whose lives are very itinerant, Zeynep, my co-producer, and I had a lot of ethical debates about whether to step in, whether to return the puppy to the construction site, or whether to adopt him in. But then we felt it was patronizing to the young men because we didn't know what the emotional impact of taking a young puppy away from these equally young men would be. And who's to say that the life we could provide this dog was better than what these young men could, because obviously Zeytin and Nazar were very well adjusted and thriving in this relationship. But before we could make any decision, the police intervened. So that decision was taken away from us. And I do have regret that we didn't step in sooner with that one, but we couldn't have foreseen that the police.
So do you know what happened to Kartal, or
no?
We...
Unfortunately, we asked the police, where did you take this dog? They didn't drop the dog off at any shelters, even though that's what they claimed they did, because we had relationships with all the shelters, government shelters throughout the city. So we suspect that a policeman must have taken Kartal in and given it to his family and just didn't want to tell us because that was technically not legal.
From George, you don't only film dogs and their activity. No, hold on. No, this. Okay, yeah. The fact that these characters are stray bring a degree of unpredictability and a freedom that feels empowering during the film, but also this enormous. It shows that the frailty of life at the margins. Mm-hmm. And this is, for example, it's very the relationship with the kids. I'm thinking in between these opposites, Zeytin, Nazar are kind of taken care of here and there. Is the population always that friendly to the dogs?
Yeah, that's what was most remarkable about Istanbul. The dogs are beloved by, I feel like, the whole city. When I would try to put those tracking collars on the dogs, everybody would come and step in very alarmed and try to warn me that I was not to touch these dogs, that these dogs belong to the community and these streets, and I didn't have a right to take them anywhere. So there was a high sense of protectiveness about these community street dogs, even though they didn't technically belong to anyone. And, as you can see in the film, fathers bringing their toddlers, shoving them into these gigantic dogs' faces. I think for people who are not used to seeing stray dogs, who are so well adjusted to a city, it's strange to imagine a father would do that. But in Istanbul, people grow up with these dogs and they treat them very well. And the government also takes care of them when they're sick. So yeah, I was quite struck by this remarkable relationship the city has.
Which is interesting also from the Istanbul's geopolitical, in Turkey in general, geopolitical situation, because they are at the crossroad of the influx of refugees and migrants, and so this sort of this tolerance and well-being, it's not matched, in the relationship with humans.
This might be a little bit controversial and I may be overstepping my bounds here, but I feel what I observed in Turkey in terms of the treatment of the young men is that actually, like, Turkey has taken so many refugees, far more than Western Europe, and whether they were paid to do that and what the political incentives are. Still, physically, they're able to seek physical safety in Turkey. And a lot of people, Turks that I talked to, were very welcoming of that. They said, they would tell me, of course, we have no political views about this because they're in need and they're our brothers. Why wouldn't we open our doors to them? So I was also very amazed by that. And even in the interactions when they're getting kicked out of the buildings and stuff, those security guards, they're still patting them on the backs and giving them like fatherly advice, like don't get addicted to glue, letting them steal the puppy, all these little gestures, even as the men are enforcing their jobs to police the streets, felt very warm to me on some level.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put it on Turkey that they, it's more like the film raises the question on how that we should be welcoming to strays, and it's just it makes a more universal point, I think, in terms of how people coming from the outside and should be accepted or integrated in the possibility of integrating them in the society. From Robert, did you put cameras on the dogs?
I did. There's one scene in the film that was captured by the dogs because I wasn't filming. It's the theft of the puppy. Zeytin, we had strapped a GoPro on her. I hadn't realized they were about to steal the puppy, so I wasn't filming. And luckily, Zeytin was filming all of that. And you could see the camera's very shaky. But for the most part, the dogs had no tolerance for, something being strapped onto their bodies and would try to rub it off very rigorously because they're not even used to collars and leashes.
You were born in Hong Kong and studied film in the U.S., right, at NYU and Stanford. Why the documentary form is the one that attracted you first to start with, right? I
think the smallness of the crew size. I think on some level I'm quite a solitary being as well. Maybe much like the stray dog subjects of my film, I like working on my own or with very few people. And I also love that everything you film in documentary feels like a bonus that you're capturing, that you're graced with capturing, unlike fiction, where everything is orchestrated and planned. And I just think my personality is to be more reactive to what is happening around me than to be directing it. So I think it's just a personality.
How small the crew was on Stray?
For the most part, it was just two people I would be shooting and a co-producer who would understand Turkish would be a recording with a bidirectional microphone, all the dialogue and all the sounds that were happening around the shoot.
And was it from Mimi? Was it difficult to get the film financed? And who paid for it?
It was very difficult, as you can probably imagine from seeing the film. In the end, we got Rooftop Films. They supported us with a filmmaker grant. And then Arri Alexa, the camera company, also sponsored us with a grant with their beautiful cameras. And then Bay Area Video Coalition supported us with a small grant. But a lot of it was also just my savings that I had earned through short films that I've been commissioned to make. But now we've made back our money in the sale of the film.
And the film is, as you were saying before, is mostly being seen virtually now, but it's opening in certain countries and certain cities so that it can be seen on a big screen.
Yeah, I think there's only 2 drive-ins in all of the U.S., which is very surprising to me. But yeah, mostly it's on virtual cinemas. You can find where it is filmed. It is showing at www.straymovie.com, and it's available for rent on all the major sort of video on demand platforms like iTunes, Amazon, Google Play.
And as in terms of documentary, if you can point to your influences, I mean, filmmakers that have inspired your view of the form, who would you point to?
I think Victor Kossakovsky, who lately released that amazing film Gunda, and I would say, actually a lot of fiction filmmakers. I think a lot of fiction filmmakers influenced me are floating in the back of my head, whether that's like Abbas Kiarostami and the simplicity of his stories, or Sean Baker, the compassion and incisiveness with which he sort of examines the margins of society, or Andrea Arnold and the really lush cinematography, Kelly Reichardt, how she only uses the authentic sounds from the city and environment that she's filming in. We were also very cognizant of that. Like all the sounds that you hear in the film are truly from Istanbul. I would say those are my influences. Maybe Michael Glaueger, the documentarian who does around the world studies, which was the original concept of the film, the stray dogs in different countries around the world. But we ended up hanging the entire film up on Zeytin in Istanbul.
I have a question from Eric. How do you know ahead of filming all the equipment you would need, GoPros, collars, buy audio microphone? Did you know ahead of time how you wanted to capture something without knowing if there really was a story there?
I did a lot of test shoots with my own pet dog and friends' dogs, like trying to film with dog's height. So those were just all the things. And the bi-directional audio microphone was from Ernst Carroll, our sound designer. I knew I wanted to work with him before we went out to shoot. And I knew we would have to figure out how to find the dogs again. So these were just kind of me working out logistically how to shoot with stray dogs before going out there. And then how did you know ahead of time how you want to capture something without knowing if there really was a story there? Yeah, no, there potentially being no story was a big risk. And I just had to have faith that the dogs would lead us somewhere. And because I had tried to shoot in 2017 during a scout where I had a more top-down, more produced approach, but that sample felt much more inauthentic. And so when I went back for the bulk of the shoot in 2018, which is when I met Zeytin, I knew that I didn't care if the film didn't have a story. Or didn't conform to conventional storytelling models. I wanted the film to truly be what a dog led us to, whether it's moments that are humorous or very dark or not, or anything in between.
And I think we're up time for like a couple of more questions. And one question is, what are you working on right now?
I don't have an answer to that. I'm working on developing my second feature-length documentary, but it's still all, the different ideas are still in early development, so I can't quite say yet.
And how long? I'm sorry, we lost you for a sec.
I was saying it's been tough with COVID also.
And how much footage did you have for this film? How much did you?
I had over 500 hours of footage that was collected from 2017 to 2019.
And it's mostly about these characters, or you have more?
I had different characters too in different cities in Turkey. One in Kars, which is in the Anatolian side of Turkey, and then which is very conservative and religious, and then another part, Bodrum, which is on the Aegean coast. And those two are now short films with two other sets of dogs, and they're on the DVD that will be released by Dog Wolf, our global UK sales agent and distributor.
Well, I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for being here, and we're very proud to be able to show the film virtually, and we make sure that your next one will be on our wonderful screen.
Thank you so much for programming
And
the film.
of course, and thank you for seeing us at a really early morning in Hong Kong, and we wish you the best for the film and for the next project.
Oh, it's such
Bye-bye.
a pleasure. Bye.